I want to thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Craig Douglas. I am Senior Vice President of HME Respiratory and Wellness, a newly developed channel here at VGM that I lead. For the last 8 years or so, I sat in the Payer Relations seat, so I was Vice President of Payer Relations. And a topic that has come up while I sat in that seat and will continue to come up is payer contracting. We're going to talk a lot about that today. I'm happy to have with me Melanie Ewald, who has recently joined the VGM team. Melanie, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Ewald, as Craig mentioned, recently joined VGM as the Vice President of Payer Relations and Reimbursement. Looking forward to working with you all on contracting. As Craig mentioned, there's lots to talk about, so we look forward to sharing a bit with you here.
And hi, everybody. I'm Kim Cuce. I am the Director of Business Optimization with VGM. Prior to my role at VGM, I was on the supplier side, so I understand exactly what everyone's going through. And I'm excited to be part of VGM and presenting this topic with you guys. I think we're going to start out. I have a question for Craig. As he stated, spent many years in payer relations. From the supplier side, there are obviously many challenges with contracts, but what are you finding is the top one or the most asked question?
The top one would probably be reimbursement, but we'll leave that alone for purposes of today. Everybody draws the line in that reimbursement discussion at a little bit different place. I think the biggest thing, the most prevalent question that I got while I sat in that payer relations seat was, how do I get in network with payers? Wherever I live, I have all of these payers that do business where I live. They have covered lives where I live. I reach out to them to join their network and they tell me they're closed. They tell me they're not looking for anybody new right now. Try back later, all of that. And that's obviously very frustrating from a DME standpoint. You're in business to serve as many patients as possible. You have doctors that send you business and they're treating these patients. When it comes time for them to have some home medical equipment or whatever the case might be, you're not able to serve them because you're not part of their provider network. So the question becomes then, what do I do when that happens? And obviously, you can continue to try to get a contract with those payers. Just know that there will be some that you may not ever get or that will take very long for you to get. You're welcome to continue to try that, to try to get those contracts. Until that happens, until you get that contract secured, there are a couple of other things that you can do. There are network management companies, third-party administrators that manage certain provider networks for certain insurance companies. If the insurance company you're looking to get a contract with utilizes any of those, you can always try to go that route and look into those companies, see if you can get an agreement in place with them that gives you that conduit to then build that health plan somewhat indirectly. If that's not really an option or it's not one that you're interested in, obviously you can still serve those patients from an out-of-network perspective. You don't have a contract that governs how you interact with those patients. You can certainly have a conversation with the patient about what it looks if they do choose to utilize you as their provider. Personally, and I think there's probably a couple of different schools of thought on this. Some providers might take the stance that this patient was referred to me or they chose to come to me. They don't know whether I'm in network or not, or maybe they do, maybe they don't. It depends on how much homework they did on that. But the bottom line is they're in my store. I have what they're looking for. I'm going to tell them I can sell it to them. Personally, I think that, I don't know, whether it's from an ethical or some other standpoint, it probably makes sense to have a conversation with that patient about what it means for them to use you as a provider. Look, I am out of network with your insurance. You can certainly highlight the fact that you have what they need. You can sell it to them today. It's very quick, painless, all of that. But if they were to go to one of the providers that their insurance has deemed an in-network or contracted provider, the cost share to them might be much lower, depending on where they're at with their deductible and their co-insurance and all of that. But in-network providers are typically using an in-network provider is typically going to result in lower out-of-pocket expenses for the patient. And depending on if it's a $20 cane, maybe not a big deal. If it's a $20,000 wheelchair, much bigger deal there. So I would certainly lean towards having that conversation with the patient so they understand that you are out of network and this is what that means from a claims processing standpoint as well as a out-of-pocket cost perspective.
Yeah. Hey, Craig, one question that I have with that, and to see if you agree with this as part of that strategy for an out-of-network coverage attempt, would you agree that it would make sense to also, as a provider, try and work with the payer to get a single case agreement on that so that you can at least have a discussion with the payer on what they require administratively as far as prior authorization, but then also to negotiate the rate so that you have some sense of what you're going to be paid. And part of that does take time to go back and forth with the payer to secure a single case agreement. So it might be helpful to let that patient know that you're working with that would be maybe a condition of being able to provide them with that service. Just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Single case agreement is a great, it shows hopefully, and the payer may agree or disagree, but it might show that there's a gap in their existing network. This patient has landed with me because they can't get it from one of the in-network options that exist. So you as a provider can always request a single case agreement. The insurance company may have a process whether they look at those requests and say, yes, we would grant that. And what that means, basically, a single case agreement, the insurance says, okay, the patient had to go to an out-of-network provider. If it's truly because there was no in-network option for them to get what they need when they need it, we will treat this out-of-network claim as though it was an in-network provider. And you'll agree with the payer on some pricing for the item that you're providing. You'll submit the claim, even though you're out of network, they're going to pay what the in-network benefits pay at 90%. They're going to process your claim at 90% based on the amount you agreed to them with. As Melanie talked about, there are some time constraints with that. So if the patient's in a rush to get what they need and they just say, look, I just want to buy it and go home with it and be done with it today, that's still an option. But the single case agreement does start you down the path of getting the insurance to maybe realize that, hey, maybe we do need this provider. Maybe they are filling a gap in our existing offering from a network standpoint, and we should look at contracting with them. I don't want to do this. Is very manual for both the payer and the provider. So if they're going to have to do this 17 more times throughout the course of the year, again, that would make maybe them look at, okay, we do need to look at contracting with this provider so we don't have to do all that manual work. Out of network, sometimes that isn't all that different than being in network. It's just there isn't a set fee schedule that you've agreed to, but they're still going to pay 80%. It's just not 80% of a fee schedule. It's maybe 80% of your billed charges or something. Other times it can be quite different billing out of network. They can go from the payer paying 90% to maybe them paying 50% of the claim, or in some cases, like with HMO plans, if you go outside the network, sometimes there are no benefits payable at all, and the patient is responsible for the entirety of the claim. So again, that's why it's important to be pretty transparent with the patient so they know they're not surprised when they get a bill for the entire amount if that's truly what's going to happen at the end of the day. When we talk about contracting, another thing the providers talked a lot about is I just want the contract to land on my desk. I want something to react to, and I have a problem getting that. But let's say you've gotten to that point with a payer and you have been sent some agreement language to react to look at. Sometimes those contracts are 10 pages, sometimes they're 100 pages, right? They can get very, very in the weeds on all of the expectations and all of the things. And I've talked to a lot of providers who say, I have an attorney on retainer, and sometimes I use them for stuff like this, but I don't want to use them all the time. I got a contract here on my desk. I want to turn it around pretty quick. They're bogged down at their office, at the attorney's office. What sections of the contract should I really focus on to make a decision whether this is something I want to participate in or not? Melanie didn't mention it, I don't think, at the beginning, but she's also an attorney by trade, so I think she's very equipped to speak to that question. So Melanie, if you've got some thoughts around that when that situation arises, we're all ears.
I did not mention that. Thank you for doing that for me. We always recommend, we're never going to say that we don't want you to read every word of your contract. We do recommend that. However, recognizing that if it's 10 pages or if it's 100 pages, it can get in the weeds, as Craig mentioned, and that can maybe be a bit cumbersome. Sometimes they start to read all the same. There's what we call just like template language. So There are about 6 or so sections that we really would suggest that you hone in on outside of just the entire contract in general. Beginning with your reimbursement terms. So you're going to want to know how and when you get paid. That's your contract should specify what your allowables are, and so that you can, what Kim will talk to later, I believe, is preventable denials, right? Making sure that you have your allowed amounts entered correctly in the how and when you get paid. She'll address that a bit more in a bit. In addition to your reimbursement terms, you're going to want to know what the payer requires as far as updates for notifications. So if you add locations, if you close locations, if you acquire another company, if you're going to sell your company, they do have, payers often have requirements for how and when you and where you send notifications to keep them abreast of your company. And you'll want to make sure that you understand what that looks like. Most notably in that there's oftentimes a time component to that, meaning that they want you to notify them within 10 days or within 30 days of a particular action. And your contract terms should explain that to you in some level of detail. In addition, you're going to want to know your initial term, your general terms of the contract. So what is your initial term length? Is it 1 to 2 years? Is it 3 years? Alternatively, is it evergreen? Does it renew annually automatically unless one of the parties takes an action to terminate or change the contract? You're going to want to know those terms and have it entered into your system correctly so that you have an ongoing contract in your system for billing purposes. And as I mentioned, relatedly, you're going to also want to know your termination requirements. Make sure that it is that both parties, you have the ability to terminate the contract, and understand what the termination requirements are. What do you have to do to terminate the contract? What type of notice is required? There's usually a notice period that is required. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand that very clearly, and so that you're prepared if you choose for whatever reason to terminate the contract, or to understand the terms by which the payer can terminate the contract with you, so that you're not surprised should they choose to make that action. Also, we talked a bit about your allowables. You'll want to know your miscellaneous code reimbursement. This isn't going to apply for everyone. It depends on your categories of products that you and services that you provide. But you will want to understand very clearly how the payer handles miscellaneous code reimbursement. Do they reimburse for miscellaneous codes? If so, which ones? And what methodology do they use to reimburse? And that could be laid out in the contract. It might also be in your fee schedule, which Kim may discuss later, as far as when you're entering your allowables into your system. But your methodologies, most commonly, you all have experienced this on some level, I'm sure, those of you that deal in miscellaneous codes, but it could be cost plus, meaning the cost for the product plus a percentage or a dollar amount, depending on the payer and what their methodology and how that's set up. So you'll want to take a look at that as far as what the miscellaneous code reimbursement and methodologies are. Make sure that you understand that well and that is articulated in your contract. And then lastly, again, this is just 6 key sections that we want you to look at. We certainly want you to look at the whole contract. But lastly, you're really going to want to know your timely filing requirements. Make sure that those are spelled out clearly in the contract, so that if you ever have any issues with timely filing, or if you bump up against it for whatever reason, you know what your time frame is, so that you can make the necessary actions to make sure that you don't run into any issues on the timely filing side. Anything that you wanted to add, Craig, on that side?
You talked about the methodologies for the miscellaneous or the manually priced items. There's a couple others that do get used by the payers, maybe percent of billed charges. I know payers kind of feel they're giving providers a blank check if they give that as an option. So that, I know it's still used, but it's maybe not as prevalent as it once was. And the last one I've seen is percent of MSRP. So if it is, it's hard to do that with custom built or custom items. They don't always have an MSRP, but for items that do, sometimes they'll use the MSRP as a benchmark and pay some percentage below that, or take a percentage discount off of the published MSRP from the manufacturer. So a couple other things to keep in mind as you're looking through the contract for that. Those are a couple other things that you might see there. All right, so we've talked a little bit about how do I get in network and how do I review a contract. What advice would you two give to providers who either feel like or maybe can prove that they're not being paid according to their contract? Like they know it and understand it well enough to know that something isn't going right here. This isn't what I signed up for. What advice would you have for those providers?
Yeah, I can take part of it. I think when you're looking at your system setup, hopefully everybody knows that just because the insurance company pays X number of dollars and puts it on an EOB, that we're taking that as gospel, so to speak. Make sure when you're setting up your system, you have a way. So if they're not paying to the full amount, that you have a way to code that. And that way you can go back from a data perspective and quantify how many times they're underpaying. Overpayment, I don't think is much of a big deal anymore, but when they're underpaying, you want to make sure that your system is set up to document that. So that you can present it to them as a whole. If you keep going at it one invoice at a time, I think you'll struggle getting their attention.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the things that I would add is if it's a reimbursement dollar amount that is different than what you're expecting, I would definitely look at your contract to understand which fee schedule they're referring to. Oftentimes the contract, let's just say it's a Medicare payer and it's a Medicare Advantage, and it might just say that they pay a percentage of Medicare or they pay the full Medicare allowable. The question becomes then, which Medicare fee schedule are they using? Because there are several. It could be straight fee for service Medicare. It could be a competitively bid rate. It could be rural. It could be non-rural. So you'll really want to understand for that particular contract, which fee schedule are they using? Because I know that can be really confusing for folks when it just says Medicare, but it doesn't specify which Medicare fee schedule. And Medicare has several, as we all know, and it could be different in a different state. So if your company is in several different states, you might have different fee schedules that you have to look at, particularly if you're in competitively bid areas. So you'll want to really make sure that you understand which fee schedule that is. And if you're having trouble determining that, number one, we hope that you always have copies of your contracts stored and saved in a repository that is easily accessible. And if you don't have, let's say you don't have access to it for whatever reason, you'll want to make sure to get in contact with a payer. Normally they've got a network development or a contract manager that if you don't have one, that oftentimes we don't have a particular person that we're working with anymore. There's a general inbox, right? Or there's a Availity, more of an online portal that we're using these days. So I would say, again, the network development or the contract managers or Availity, which should have the ability to get you that fee, that contract. And if it doesn't state the particular fee schedule, then you would want to ask for the separate fee schedule as a second addendum to that contract. Availity oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes should have that fee schedule that is associated to your contract available on that portal as well, along with some other administrative requirements such as prior auth and things like that typically. But so we would recommend that you definitely have a copy of it so that you can look at that first before you contact the payer, and then you position yourself from a place of, this is my understanding of what I should be paid. This is the fee schedule that we should be working off of. And then you can work with a payer from there going forward on obtaining correct reimbursement.
So if I were to summarize what I just heard from the two of you, there's two key takeaways. One, make sure you keep your contracts. You're going to have to revert back to them at some point. Make sure you know where they are and you know where you can find them and who has access to them and all of that. The second thing, what Melanie talked about with the differences prior to competitive bidding, Medicare wasn't as messy as it is today from a fee schedule perspective. What she said about making sure you know which Medicare they're paying, whatever percentage they're paying off of, that's really, really important. Some payers are based in one state, but they may do business in others. She's absolutely right that each state has their own rate, and then you get into all the competitive bidding stuff, and there's so many different Medicare rates for a single item, even within a given state. It's really important to know which one they're benchmarking off of if they are pointing to a Medicare fee schedule, make sure you understand which one they're pointing to. So given all of that, if we were looking at how to make sure we're operationalizing all of that advice and getting it into our system right away, the right way, Kim, talk a little bit about what that looks like, what some best practices for providers would be in order to make sure that they're protecting themselves as much as possible when they're abiding by these contracts and all the terms within them?
We'd love to answer that. I'm so glad you asked that question. In working with our members, I think we need to start looking at our contracts different. Many people look at the contracts as they just want to look at the allowables. And granted, that is one of the most important things, but we almost need to start looking at contracts as an operational blueprint. And that's to avoid the avoidable denials, as I talk about. But also, when you really understand your contract, you can communicate better with your patients, which is obviously better outcomes. One of the biggest things with I'm going to break down a couple of the components, but obviously the allowable is a big thing. It's not just, am I getting paid enough for it? We are an industry that for some reason just doesn't like to collect the patient copay. Almost everywhere I go into, we just say, oh, that's okay. We're screaming at the insurance companies, we need more money, but we're not collecting the copays, or we're chasing it on the back end. So what we're hoping is that people start to collect that money up front. Well, the only way you can successfully collect that money up front and for it to be efficient is if your allowables are right and your system tells you what the patient responsibility is. So I think there's several caveats to why the allowable is important in your fee schedules and in your system setup. I'm saying fee schedules and price tables, that's Brightree's terminology, but other systems might call it something different. But you want to make sure that you have your allowables loaded correctly. Modifiers, I think, are a given. Please do not assume that everybody follows Medicare's modifiers, because they don't. If you leave one off or if you add too many, that might cause a denial. That obviously operationally down the road causes a lot of problems and an increase in FTEs to fight those denials. The next thing would be your rent to purchase option. So when you load your item into the system, a lot of times it could be a rental, it could be a purchase. But within those individual price tables, you can determine what that insurance company will pay. So knowing how they pay for it is just as important as what they will pay for it. If the Medicaid, some of the state Medicaids are going away from renting equipment. So a lot of them are starting to purchase it. So if you have that in your contract, why are you not doing it that way? Why are you not expiring and taking out the rental option altogether so that when you're hiring that new customer service rep, they don't have to memorize every single contract and every single item. It's in there. It's hard coded for them. So they technically can't make a mistake on some of that stuff. That also is important. Also tying back to the patient journey, which I'm very big on right now. If they don't have to get 13 invoices, they're probably significantly happier. I think that's kind of twofold. The next thing would be PARs. Obviously, it is important to know whether an item requires a PAR. I don't think there's any insurance companies any longer that are backdating PARs. So when you know that it requires a PAR, make sure you're process mapping how that looks in your company. What I see a lot of times is somebody thinks they're getting a PAR, but that PAR team doesn't get it for days after the fact. So that has to happen prior to delivery. So knowing what requires a PAR is important. But also as important is what is your process? Process map that internally to make sure that you're capturing that. Most companies that we're working with, I think they think, well, we'll just get it on the back end. But think about that from a personal perspective. If you go in to get something and you don't know, and the company's just letting you check out and you think everything's fine, and you get a bill later, you're going to be angry. So one of our big points is that we stand above everybody from a customer service perspective. So imagine the patient journey. If you know it's not covered and you're not having that conversation with them up front, you're causing some bad experience right there. Knowing non-covered so that they can talk about that up front, I think is also very important. Know what codes are going to be bundled. This one particular insurance company will not pay for CPAP supplies during the rental period. So now you have a business decision to make. It's bundled. You don't necessarily want to book bad revenue, but you also have further business decisions to make. Are you going to put them into a campaign to actively get them resupply every 90 days? Are you going to wait? There's lots of decisions to go in there. When you know something's going to be bundled, you really have to bring that back to understand how you're going to handle all that. And then the last thing, allowables, which we all touched on, and the importance of that, and that is from billing, increasing your revenue, decreasing your denials, less work, overall patient experience. Everybody's on the same page and they know. So it's not just about allowables anymore. I think all of the other things we talked about are huge, if not as important as those.
For sure.
I would agree.
So maybe just a couple other random or miscellaneous questions that kind of tie into some of the stuff we've been talking about before we wrap this up. The first one, we talked about how important it is to make sure you are keeping copies of your contracts. Maybe you just bought this business or you had a fire that destroyed. If you find yourself in a position where you don't have a copy of the contract that you're looking for, trying to see what it says about a certain thing, what do you do if you don't have a copy of that contract? I know going forward, having heard us talk today, you're all going to keep every contract you get from this point forward. But say you don't have one from a while back, what do you do there?
Yeah, ideally, if you have a good relationship with your contact at the payer, you give them a call and you ask them for a copy of the contract. That's ideal state, right? We know that now a lot of payers don't have a designated person for us to work with. So oftentimes we're working with a general office or a general department. And they commonly go by payer contracting, provider contracting, or network development. So you'll want to get in contact with those departments depending on the payer and whatever they call that department, and give them a call or use their process, which is often also online. You can submit a request for your contract. Be sure that you provide them with your MPI, your appropriate information, ask them for a copy of the contract. And outside of that, as Craig said, we want to make sure we have a copy of it, but this might also be an opportunity to open the door to have some other conversations about your contract. So it can be tedious. It can take a bit of time for those of you that may not have gone down this path before, it can take some time to get a response, particularly from general inboxes, but that is part of contracting. And unfortunately, it's the lay of the land these days, is we have to be persistent in continuing to submit follow-up requests for whatever it is that we need. And in this particular instance, in this context, it would be an actual copy of your contract. And make sure you get the executed copy if you
Very
can.
important detail. Yeah.
Squeaky wheel, persistence. When I was a supplier and I was having a hard time with one of the insurance companies, I set a timer on my phone every day at 5:05 because I knew I could reach this person at 5:05. So every day I called. I finally just broke her down and she ended up giving me what I wanted. But squeaky wheel, persistence.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a situation where, I mean, there are really only two entities that are party to that agreement, right? It's you, the supplier, and the payer, and nobody else is going to have a copy of that agreement. If you don't have it, really the only other place to get it is the other party to the agreement. They're so, at least historically, they sign a contract with you and they say, you don't share this with anybody. The terms, the conditions, this is just between you and me, and there isn't anybody else to get that contract from because you weren't supposed to share it. That maybe brings me to the last thing I would want to cover today. Speaking of things that were once very privileged and held close to the vest, maybe now a little bit more public, when you're negotiating with a payer and they're telling you things, we pay you what we pay everybody, or what we offered you is the most we can offer anybody, or are there tools that you can utilize out there that either shine a light on that or bring some perspective, or any tools that you can leverage when negotiating with a payer?
Yes. So recent changes have made some of that information and some data available to us publicly that previously, historically, had been proprietary. And that is part of the Transparency and Coverage Act. And that data is available through several different companies. I'm not the expert in this, Craig. I would ask you to chime in on this a bit, but that information that is required through the Act is limited to commercial plans. It does not include Medicare or Medicare Advantage and managed Medicaid data. So the rates for those plans and those contracts will not be included in the data that you acquire should you choose to work with one of those companies that makes it available. VGM also has market data, which is available for purchase and is based on claims data. So it is different than the transparency and coverage data in that it is based on claims and it does cover all of the lines of business, Medicare Advantage, commercial, and managed Medicaid. And that is something that is offered. Data is king. And so those are two really good sources for us to use as providers in trying to negotiate our contracts and making sure that we are getting the the best rates that we can, while also making sure that we're not maybe at the top, that we're reasonably in there so that we can continue to maintain contracts long term.
We've definitely seen payers use the phrases right sizing our network or whatever. If you're at the top in terms of reimbursement, sometimes they may see you as a target for elimination if that's a possibility for them. If other providers are willing and able to do or provide the same products and services that you are, but do it for less, they may look at whether they could maybe exist without you. So point well made there. And you're right, the transparency and coverage legislation, it does have some drawbacks just in terms of not including all business lines. It is the only requirement anyway is for payers to publish their contracted rates with all provider types, but only at the commercial line of business level. There are a few that have maybe chosen to include, since they have to publish some information anyway, they either see it as easier or maybe it's by mistake, but we have seen some of the payers publishing some of their Medicare Advantage or Medicaid if they play in those lines of business as well. But the legislation, the law does not require them to include those other lines of business, just the commercial one. So some of the companies that you mentioned that are taking that raw data from the payers and publishing it or trying to turn it into something more meaningful and palatable. This is all new. All this legislation just was passed in the last couple of years and really only impacted DME specifically in the last couple of years. So it's all new to them. They may not, the companies that have popped up that are taking this data and trying to make something of it, they may not understand DME fully, all the different modifiers. And certainly you start looking at capped rental categories where not only do you have NU or RR, but you have KH, KI, KJ, different months have different reimbursement rates and all of that. And they may not place of service is another key component of that. All of those modifiers drive what the actual allowable is, and this DME space with all of that included is kind of hard to understand for outsiders, and that's where a lot of these sit right now. So I think everything else you said was absolutely spot on, and those are very, very impactful tools to use and leverage for sure. So with that, anybody have any closing remarks?
Find your contracts.
Find your contracts, that's right, and store them in a place where they're all together, where everybody can find them that needs them.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for giving us a little bit of your day today. Feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.